Good afternoon from the NEST Centre in London and welcome to our midweek briefing. My name is John Lough. I'm the head of foreign policy. Today we're discussing perceptions of NATO in Russia and whether there might be a risk of confrontation between NATO and Russia as the war in Ukraine continues. The NEST team, when we met earlier this week, we were all struck by the response from Moscow to a statement by General Donahue, who is the US Army Europe and Africa commander, who was speaking at a military conference in Germany on July the 19th about the execution of a new Eastern Flank deterrence line, to use NATO parlance, a plan that aims to improve NATO's ground-based capabilities. And the general, speaking perhaps a little casually, and it appears without notes, he said in passing that NATO had the ability now to deter Russian aggression through its ability to use ground forces to take down, in his words, Russia's anti-access aerial denial capability, this A2AD capability, in his words, in a time frame that is unheard of and faster than we've been able to do. Now, this provoked a furious response from Moscow. Nikolai Patrushev, who up until 2024 was the long-standing Secretary of the Security Council, still a member of the Security Council and one of Putin's closest associates, Patrushev said that any attack on Kaliningrad would meet with, and I quote, an immediate and crushing response using all means available. And it was clearly stated that these means included nuclear capabilities. So in the background, there is in several NATO countries, there has been speculation about when and where Russia might strike next. General Breuer, the Inspector General of the German Army, for example, has warned that Russia could attack NATO in the next 4 or even less years. So that's very unusual for a German general to speak in that way. And in the run-up to the NATO summit in June, the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, warned that member states that do not invest in defense would pay a price. And as he put it, if we don't act now, the next 3 years we are fine, he said, but we have to start now, because otherwise, from 3, 4, or 5 years from now, we are really under threat. And I'm quoting his words there. And he added, I really mean this. Then you have to get your Russian language course out or go to New Zealand. So to discuss what might be brewing or indeed not brewing on both sides and where events might lead us, I'm delighted to have with us James Sherr, who these days is an honorary fellow at the International Centre for Defence and Security in Tallinn, where he's resided for, I think, over 5 years now. James is known to many of our viewers because of his lucid analysis of Russian security and defense policy and his very deep knowledge of Ukraine. And it's rare that a Western analyst knows both countries so well. James and I have had the pleasure of working together in different institutions over the course of more than 3 decades. So James, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for joining. Before we go any further, can I please remind our participants that there is a chat function, and if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please put it in the chat, and I will do my best to get to you. So James, to kick us off, from a political perspective, it's possibly tempting at the moment for the Russian leadership to be dismissive about NATO and to see it as a seriously weakened alliance because of President Trump's quite clearly lukewarm commitment to alliances in general. It's true that the June summit was not the kind of debacle that some people had predicted. Trump persuaded the Europeans to cough up, to pay up for their defense, and I think went away happy. So perhaps all credit to Mark Rutte for the way he did it, if it even was for him, I think, rather humiliating. But from a military perspective, I think one has to say that the Russian General Staff always plans on the basis of the worst case scenario. You'd surely have to say that NATO is still a viable actor. It is significantly strengthened in the Baltic region after the accession of Finland and Sweden. So Russia surely will be keen to avoid the possibility of a military confrontation. Do you think this is a correct reading, or am I simply here being a little bit too logical? What do you think?
First of all, John, thank you very much for this invitation, and I'd like to thank the Centre as a whole for its invitation and your very flattering comments at the beginning. I think, as with all matters Russian, the truth is always better and worse than we imagine it to be. The Russians, of course, by Western standards, invest an enormous amount and with very proficient results in communication and diplomacy and information and disinformation and so on. And even if you know the interlocutors well and the characters and know what they have written and said, it's difficult on the basis of one thing or another to get a sense of whether they're angry or they're relaxed, or whether they're very self-confident or very worried. I don't think there's very much about the military side of NATO that is a mystery to them. And so there is nothing that General Ben Hodges' successor, maybe his successor plus one now, General Donahue, would have said that would have been regarded by military professionals there as surprising. I think it's important to understand that despite appearances and despite the egregious misjudgments that have accompanied the launch of Russia's war in Ukraine, Russia preserves a very disciplined, very sober military tradition. And everything they think and plan for and do is done on the basis of, is done on a very solid analytical basis, despite the political factor, despite the fact that that all of these things depend, rightly, to a large extent, on judgments about the adversary, beginning with Ukraine, that can be fundamentally flawed. So I would just say that if Rutte by and large has got it right, in my view, and have a couple caveats, qualifications to that. But whatever is being said in the Kremlin, I do not see the Russians, with respect to NATO, least with respect to NATO, starting a war out of pique, or because they feel cornered, or because they've been insulted, or out of impulse. But they have done an exceptionally fine job over more than 4 years now, throughout the time the Biden administration was in power, persuading people that if we use our own power, our own capacity, in a truly effective way, this will promote Russia into escalating dangerously and doing something irrational. Well, I've always been deeply skeptical about all this. This is just not the Russian tradition. There is too much history and too much of a track record here. That's not who we're dealing with. So I don't think they are going to suddenly lash out at NATO or play games or conduct an experiment just to see how we might respond. We're not dealing with people like that.
But it's interesting that it's almost become an article of faith in the Western discourse that the Russians will do this. at some point, because they're searching for our weak points. They know where many of our weak points are. Of course, they know how to press on some of them. But I tend to share your view that they're going to be very circumspect, not least because they're bogged down in a war in Ukraine that they can't get out of very easily. But I mean, if I were to challenge your logic, I would say that in 2022, they embarked on something where they really, yes, there were intelligence failures, but the Russian general staff knew full well that there were limitations to the force it had. It wasn't appropriately sized to take on the job of certainly fighting in Ukraine or indeed occupying Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons why the Ukrainian side thought that Russia was simply playing games on the border. And this was all designed to intimidate both Ukrainians and its Western allies.
Right.
So what was it then that pushed them over the edge and made them go for it?
Well, there are two questions here, but my most immediate response is, and it does reiterate what I said before, their understanding of Ukraine, by they, I mean the top decision makers and, of course, Vladimir Vladimirovich himself. Their fundamental understanding and perception about Ukraine has been, and in my view continues to be, deeply flawed. If all of the decisions are being put in motion by somebody with a deeply flawed, almost delusional perception about who the Ukrainians are, about what one can expect from them, and all the rest of it, well, certain things will inevitably follow. That doesn't contradict the points I was making with regard to an adversary like NATO, which I don't think the Russians approach from a basically hubristic or emotive basis, as they.
Yeah, that is an important distinction, isn't it? That when it comes to Ukraine, over decades, we've seen in the case of the Kremlin that there is a blind spot. There's something that they simply do not see in Ukraine, which is obvious to many of us, which is that Ukraine and Ukrainians have changed greatly over 30 years. And this is no longer Soviet Ukraine. But when it comes to NATO, I think I share your view that there isn't a sort of emotional view of the organization. Yes, that there is sometimes, I think, some maybe fake anger about NATO enlargement and the way all that process was handled, and Putin himself occasionally succumbs to some of that. I think he's almost sort of whipped himself up into believing that somehow Russia was mistreated. Even if George Robertson, the former Secretary General, he published, he was quoted in an interview a few days ago conducted by Laurie Friedman, where he said, I think he met Putin something like 11 times, and Putin never raised the issue of NATO enlargement, which is kind of telling in itself, isn't it? But I suspect when it comes to assessing NATO's capabilities, then there is a much more sober and possibly rational assessment of what Russia has and doesn't have, and how it would cope if it was put into a shooting match with NATO.
Let me mention just one or 2 points before I lose them. The first is that the Russian views that we're talking about with regard to Ukraine, its predisposition, these go back for centuries. The expression "самостоятельной Украине никогда не будет," Ukraine will never be able to live on its own, to survive on its own. This expression well predates the Soviet period. So, I mean, this is deeply encoded. The second point, though, although, and I've spoken to George Robertson about this as well, the Russians from the beginning, we might have exaggerated the extent to which the Russians viewed NATO enlargement as a military threat. But what they did understand was that it was a great civilizational threat, that it guaranteed that the new model and the liberal democratic model taking root in Eastern and Central Europe was a permanent change, was a fundamental change. and that did represent, in this broader civilizational and historical sense, an isolation and a weakening of Russia. And that is what has always distressed them. And it leads to a point I should have made earlier on when you were talking about the NATO summit. The Russian intentions about NATO, I think, were very accurately and honestly spelt out in the December 2021 draft treaties. One for NATO, one for the United States, stipulating, amongst other things, that all NATO forces introduced after May 1997 had to be withdrawn. And they're very serious about this. The Russians, very honestly believe we have no fundamental difficulty with the West if we understand by the West the historical West, the Cold War West, the West behind the Oder River, Oder-Neisse line, all the rest of it, as it was put to me in some places. The countries that were part of the Holy Roman Empire, that's the West. Everything else has been an encroachment. Everything else has been an encroachment onto our legitimate space. Now, these thoughts are very potent and they drive policy. And they are at least as important as the military evaluation they might have. But we as analysts have to separate these two things. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, that is an extremely important point. I mean, it has to be said that back in 1997, when the NATO-Russia Founding Act was negotiated, the Russian side, I mean, I was working in Moscow at that time and had good access to people both in the Russian Foreign Ministry and indeed the Ministry of Defense. And my impression was that the Russian side was actually quite happy with what it got, because it felt it had put really quite severe limitations on NATO's ability to exploit, if you like, these territories, which had, of course, previously been part of a Russian zone of influence.
Mm.
And NATO kept to that, so no substantial combat forces permanently stationed on the territory of those countries, no nuclear weapons, and they could see very well that NATO was disarming at the same time. And in some ways, it's remarkable that they've been able to sustain this notion of NATO, I mean, at least for public consumption, of NATO presenting such a serious military threat, when you look at what the alliance is now having to do to rebuild its military capability. And the NATO's enlargement to the Baltic states, I always felt, was a kind of fair weather project.
Absolutely.
Because nobody believed that we were going to get into a serious military confrontation. But I mean, you've been living in Estonia for a good while now. What do you think the mood is in Estonia in this current environment? I mean, I noticed I noted an article by one of your colleagues, ICDS, recently. I can't remember what it was called. The next Narva, or sorry. Yeah, will Russia? Yeah, will Russia then go for?
He said the article was entitled "Is Narva Next," which
that's right. Sorry, yes, excuse me.
Rather ironic way. Yeah.
And the argument was that no, this is much hyped because Estonia has some significant military capability compared to what it had in the past. It's obviously integrated here into a NATO framework. There's a NATO battle group in Estonia. So this is part of the enhanced forward presence. So we should dismiss this notion. But when it comes to maybe some non-kinetic activity, then you've written an excellent monograph about Russia's, I think, hard diplomacy and soft coercion, that it has the very good title that Russia has multiple instruments it can use here to try to encourage countries to follow its line, or to accept at least the limitations of their geography.
One of the exam questions I have always been fond of asking is this: had the Russia Georgia war predated the decision to enlarge NATO to the Baltic states, would that enlargement have taken place? You said it was a fair weather enlargement because NATO undertook it on the assumption that military force was no longer going to be an instrument of policy in Europe. Then we had the Georgia War. And the big, I think, fundamental problem here, which we overlook, which goes beyond the enormous efforts NATO has to take to rebuild itself and reacquire in a more technologically advanced form capabilities that have been lost. It's a bigger issue. The frontier of NATO now is the Russian border. In the Cold War, it wasn't. It was the Warsaw, it was the Warsaw Pact, and we had shorter supply lines. We had terrible supply lines, problems and anxieties. We had shorter supply lines than we have now. So we're right up against the Russian border, and some of you might have seen it if you read the FT. The past couple of days, I think his title is the Commissioner for Transport of the EU, issued a set of very bluff warnings about how much has to be invested and how quickly in Europe to ensure that armies will be able to reinforce those contingents that are in the Baltic states. So I think this is where the core military vulnerability comes from, that we had until recently here stationed a tripwire force. Now it's tripwire plus. Yeah. Will the Russians take it seriously or not? But add to this, and this is the biggest issue for me, and we go back to the June summit again. The biggest question is, what is going to happen to the American component here in all of this? We have, 35,000 Americans in Germany alone. I think that's their largest presence. They have considerable presence in Poland. They have some here. And there is a lot of talk, which makes sense if you're in the Trumpian worldview, that the forces that Biden added, that in fact they weren't. Yeah, the forces that Biden added are the most likely now to be withdrawn. What they conveniently don't say is that a lot of the most significant recent US augmentations took place in the early part of Trump's first administration.
Yes, I know. Of course, no one doesn't want to remember that.
If those
James, we have
withdrawn, I know, but I'm sorry, this is a big military problem. Very briefly on what I think is your main point. There is a surprising amount of people have invested into a caricature understanding of what the Baltic states are like and what our situation is. People think we are somehow inherently very vulnerable to internal destabilization and that the Russian factor is a very subversive factor and all of the rest of it. Marek's article set out in very clear terms why a lot of this is simply not so, but I live here with this, and that is not something that worries me. What does worry us? Two factors: the cohesion of the alliance, which by definition is not cohesive if there is no certainty of American backing. And secondly, a Russian judgment or misjudgment that whatever the military balance might be, NATO is psychologically demoralized and confused, and it is politically weak and fragmented. And then if you get into some kind of a tussle, as we have done recently in May, in the Baltic states regarding cables or something else, I think the risk of war goes up a lot because of the calculations that Russia will make about the robustness of the adversary. And if they get that wrong, we could go over the cliff.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the point, isn't it? That in some places, they do misjudged things, and Ukraine is a prime example of that, and could, in this new situation, and a really rather dynamic situation, because a lot of the time we don't know what Trump is going to say or do next, could they misread something? Now, we have two questions that have come in, and I want to get to both of them, so I'd be grateful if you could be relatively brief.
Yes.
Henrik Zeip asks, James, do you think Putin ever imagined Finland and Sweden could join NATO as part of his 2022 risk assessment?
A superb question. I think he imagined it before it happened, but I don't think that was, let's put it this way. In that critical year when the Russians were deciding whether it was safe to go to war against Ukraine, even though most of this was all done, and in the period leading up to that, and the post-2014 period, I don't really think they saw that happening. What they did see was, I think, the Russians, by 2014, by the time they publicly said, we need new rules or there will be no rules. But 2014 was the time they said the so-called rules-based Western-dominated international order is finished. It is deformed, it is weakened, it has no legitimacy. That's when they said that, and that's when they became predisposed to an adversarial relationship. And for those reasons, I think the entry of Finland and Sweden into NATO did not rattle them very much because it was consistent with these expectations and this whole view of things.
Yeah, and if you were then to make the assumption that because the West was weakened, and indeed the United States, and you could sense, during Trump 1, that the alliances were being called into question, therefore did an enlarged NATO have the same weight or indeed capabilities before? And the answer to that, of course, is no. They would see it differently. Let's go to the second question, which is from Laura Brady. Laura asks, do you think there'll be any Russian reply to Trump's 10 to 12 day deadline? And if not, what do you think will happen next? Laura says, China doesn't appear to plan to stop buying Russian oil. Will the US supply long-range missiles to Ukraine?
In my view, the Russians doubt, as I will honestly say I do, that despite this sudden shortening of the deadline, that Trump means it. That Trump is really congenitally capable of standing up to Putin in any sustained and serious way. Maybe he will prove me wrong, and maybe he will prove Moscow wrong. It's not the first time I've agreed with the Kremlin about something. But what is interesting, and Laura, you would have noticed it, when Trump announced the 50-day deadline, the Russian stock market went up immediately, meaning ha. When they announced that it had been shortened to 12 days, the value of the Russian ruble dropped. So at least the wider markets in Russia, whoever defines those, seem to have drawn breath. I can't see the Kremlin panicking over this until there is real evidence that things are going to change, and that will, you'd look for it in two places. The most obvious, of course, is with the secondary energy sanctions. But the other one is whether the United States is willing to supply Ukraine with the weapons it really needs. And I'm not talking about quantity. I mean long-range weapons that can hit the factories that are producing the drones and other advanced munitions that are destroying Ukraine at the moment. These are the two key questions. And I am very skeptical as to whether that is going to happen. But I think the key point is I think the Kremlin is.
But it is striking at the same time that I don't believe the Kremlin thought Trump would use military force against Iran.
No, I think they were taken aback by that.
So this will just prove their point that the US president is unpredictable.
Yeah, and he is. But they will also have seen, after being stunned, and they're going back and the professionals looking at it, and what they will see is that the Israelis kindly took down all of Iran's air defenses for the Americans before they did this, and that Iran was a lot weaker than they thought. And therefore, that when Trump was doing this, when launched this campaign, which Trump claims has obliterated Iran's nuclear capability, that he was not really taking any risks. Whereas everything we are urging him to do in Ukraine does involve taking risks, which Russia's trying to inflate, which I think are exaggerated, but the risks are there. So far, the evidence does not suggest that Trump is a risk taker.
No, it doesn't, but he is caught between two forces here domestically, isn't he? Because the MAGA base doesn't want the US to be more involved in these distant wars. And at the same time, there's still a majority in Congress that believes Ukraine deserves the support of the United States.
Well, this is why, John, that I don't think the Russians are panicking, because as long as these two perceptions are so deeply entrenched, the United States is not going to be taking the actions that need to be taken if we are going to preserve Ukraine from an endlessly long process of destruction and defeat. Yeah. The game needs to be raised, the strategy needs to change. We're not here to discuss that at the moment, but there's nothing I would say about either of those 2 points that would be terribly new, but they are still very far from the political realities we're dealing with.
Indeed. James, we need to stop there because we've run out of time. Half an hour passes very quickly. I want to thank you very much for joining us today. I want to thank our viewers for being with us. And I want to say that the NEST Centre did intend to be taking a break from the weekly briefings in August, but we did say there's one proviso, and that is that things tend to happen in Russia in August. And what I noticed is that I believe next Thursday, the Trump deadline expires. So I think we're going to be back next week talking a bit indeed about where things stand, what the effect of these sanctions on India might be if they're still in place by that time, and how the world might look at that point. So we hope to see you again next week. James, once again, many thanks for joining us.
And thanks to you. Thanks a lot.